Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Mary Ferguson. I'm a program manager here at SUMSI. And for the benefit of our visually impaired participants, we're asking each person to describe themselves on the screen. Let me describe how I appear on the screen. I am a Caucasian woman with light skin, wearing black rimmed glasses and a black and gold dress. This session is Humans in Homegrown Transportation, meeting the users where they are, and will be a panel discussion where there's no moderator. The panelists on this session are Frank Lee, who is a Director of Transportation with the Center for Pan-Asian Community Services, Julia Nebrija, who is the co-founder and director at Agile City Partners, Kim Lucas, who is the Assistant Director at the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure with the City of Pittsburgh, and Sanni, who is the CEO of Dollaride. Their full bios are all below the session if you'd like to learn more about each of the panelists. And I'm just gonna, at this point, ask all the panelists if they could provide an overview of your background and how you got into this field.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Nice to be with you here. I'm Julia, and I will describe myself. I am wearing a white and black shirt over a athletic outfit. I just got back from a walk. I brushed my hair today and put on a little bit of makeup for you, which is special. And yes, I am just really happy to be joined here by my co-panelists. I am working actually in the global transportation field on informal transportation with the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation. And we are really excited about elevating this conversation to a lot of different cities. You might be using paratransit or informal transit where you live, or it might be something new to you. I came across it living in places like New York City and also in the Philippines in the city of Manila. And I think it's just something that is not talked enough about. And that's great that we're talking about it here. Thank you.
And I can go next. My name is Kim Lucas. I'm the Assistant Director, as was mentioned, for the City of Pittsburgh's Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. I'm a biracial woman of Black and white descent, and my hair is pulled back today with big earrings and a navy blue top. In my department today, we engage very minimally with informal transportation systems. That's kind of the nature of them being informal. We're the city and we're out there doing public transportation and these publicly funded systems that are very regimented and have bureaucracy behind them. And the truth is, while we know these networks are functioning and existing in our city, we don't know too much more about them just by their very nature. And so some of the things that I want to learn more about with chatting with my peers here is, do they need help from city governments, or is it not broke, don't fix it? And learning more about how these systems might be operating, since they're by nature operating kind of under the radar. And I found myself in this position after years in transportation that began with my first job as a bus driver when I was in college. So I had a commercial driver's license and was actually operating transit vehicles. And that set me off on the path of transportation planning and transportation operations. And so I'm really excited to have been exposed to so many different types in the course of those years.
So did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll go. Hey folks, my name is Sanni. I'm the CEO and one of the founders of a company called Dollaride. I'm a Black male with brown skin. I'm wearing a green olive shirt today. I have a very, very short haircut, and I'm devilishly good looking. Well, what brings me here today and into this whole career of working in transit and with mobility is some personal experiences I've had growing up in New York City. Much like Julia, I became familiar with informal transit in New York City through our system that we colloquially call dollar vans. It's something that I've taken ever since I was about 12 or 13 years old, living in the outskirts of Brooklyn. So I became really familiar with that service as a passenger. But I also learned maybe about 5 or 6 years ago that I had family members who were in the dollar van industry. And at one point, I spent the summer interning with one of my uncles, who was a dollar van driver and now a fleet owner. And that was when I uncovered the unit economics of a driver and the business practices of fleet owners, which really fascinated me and helped me uncover how important these services were to local communities, but also how much they can become economic drivers for opportunity for the drivers and the people who are involved in the service on the commercial side. So I'm a huge advocate for informal transit and very much looking forward to creating pathways to collaborate with the public transportation sector. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to make change.
Hi, everybody. I'm Frank Lee, Director of Transportation here at Center for Pan Asian Community Services. I'm an East Asian male, and I'm wearing a gray shirt. The length of my hair is pandemic length, and the style of it is mom cut. So maybe that's not as good as Sue's description. But yeah, I stumbled into this work in the middle of the pandemic. I came back from a brief stint in Mexico, and I had actually approached this organization about getting involved in affordable housing work. And my background is mostly in land use and community development and nonprofit community development work. And I guess they thought that I was the closest that they could get to navigating some FTA regulations. And so that's how I joined the transportation industry. We are probably the most, we are the organization that's probably straddling the line between informal and formal. Informal in the sense that it really grew from a need in the community that was identified. I think one of our new CEO just said that we started as a transportation organization because some of the new Korean immigrants would just look in the phone book and call our organization because it had Korean in the name at the time and ask for a ride from the airport. And so we came all the way, maybe 40 years now. I'm trying to navigate a lot of the FTA regulations, get in compliance so that we can really expand and continue to serve communities. So this conversation for me is important as well as necessary for steps forward for my organization.
It's so interesting because I'm actually the odd one out because I'm working more internationally. But at the same time, it's so interesting to see so many parallels. So I think a lot of times people think of informal transportation, they think of the context like Manila, like a big city in India or in Bangkok or in Hanoi or wherever, all across Latin America and Africa. And we don't think about the fact that at the basic, it's like what you said, it's meeting a need, it's bridging a mobility gap, it's providing livelihood, and it's feeding entrepreneurship in so many cities and connecting communities who are kind of historically marginalized or disenfranchised. And that I think is common in any of the cities in the world. And so I actually have a question for Frank, because when you're talking about working at that community level, what are you finding? What is your experience not coming from like having this community center be a mobility provider initially, even, what's that transition been like for you in terms of providing community services? That it makes a lot of sense. There's probably so many, I know through personal experiences, my parents actually live in Florida. Like there's not even sidewalks in most of the neighborhoods. And if you can't afford to live somewhere that's near work, or you're part of a community that doesn't have a bus line, you're kind of in the same situation that many of the neighborhoods are in Manila that I lived in. What's that been like for you?
Yeah, it's completely unexpected. I came in, I was like, oh, read a couple FTA regs and we'll just get in compliance here and there. Not much work to be done. When I joined, and we had a couple staff turnover and some other things where I had to really get my hands dirty with operations, and I'm picking up calls from clients for all kinds of appointments and trying to troubleshoot on the fly. That that flexibility that we provide is why we exist. I think flexibility, I had this conversation 2 weeks in where I was trying to say, oh no, we have a waiting period, or I ever forgot what I was trying to implement. It was a ready window of 30 minutes. And the drivers were like, that's not going to work, because sometimes we go and we knock on people's doors to get them to work. And so I was like, oh, this is more of a social worker on wheels type of, a case manager on wheels type of service. Finding that out has been a challenge, because I think at the core of what we do is flexibility. And as you know, I think at the core of FTA regulations is inflexibility. So trying to be that middle ground and also provide quality customer service at very, very limited, with very limited resources as a nonprofit organization is definitely a challenge, but also something that I feel like there's a lot of opportunity in. So yeah, informality and flexibility is something our communities need. We're coming up on implementing microtransit and new technology. I will be very interested in to see how we can balance both efficiency and flexibility.
One question I had for the panel is around actually naming, or the nomenclature that we use for this field or this space. So on this call, we've been talking about it in the sense of informal transit, but I know, Julia, you're working with the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation, and Benji, he often brings up, the terminology of makeshift mobility. And paratransit can also be used depending on perhaps the context, or maybe even the geography. Are there specific, I guess, terms, or how do you guys think about describing this space? Because it seems like it can fluctuate or change depending on the audience or the context.
I'll just take a stab on it. We know that informal transportation, the informal part, is kind of a second best option, and it's evolving, and there's lots of ways to call it. I think one of the issues with paratransit is that it assumes that you're using that transit to go between two places. So I'm taking the dollar van to get to the subway to get to somewhere else, as opposed to I'm actually taking the dollar van for my whole point A to point B. So I agree that there's different ways to think about it. At the core, a lot of informal transportation, they will be regulated to some degree. They might have a permit. They might be paying, something to someone to be able to exist. So it's not in the sense of it being, completely illegal, I think is one of the myths. But it is that you might not have, you're not going to have designated stops or set schedules all the time, and, followed headways. Frank's knocking on doors. He's not like leaving at 5 minutes from this stop that he's promised. So I think that has a lot to do with it. That flexibility is part of what helps to find commonality. The homegrownness, like what this top panel is about. I think there are some common characteristics that really help to identify what looks similar, even if the one name doesn't capture all of them. I don't know how you guys are. Yeah.
The thing that's coming to mind for me, to over bureaucratize it, is it's kind of community transit. If we're the people running public transit, because it's funded by the public in a large collective way, and these other networks are really serving the community, but might be some level of formal, like you're saying, if they're paying permits, if they have designated pickup drop off, it could be a lot of different providers. And if we're looking at public, private, and community, those could be the big buckets that this could fall into. I think, I spoke with some of my staff before this panel to get prepared to find out, what do we know about these networks? We have an idea of, and these are my community planners that are actively trying to engage communities where we know that they exist to educate and connect with micromobility, for example, or for a longish range mobility transportation plan. So people who are really trying to get out into the community. And the answers I got were, well, we think they're doing grocery trips. We think that, it's a lot of older individuals, but they don't want to share. They don't want to share a lot of this information, and that makes a lot of sense to me. I think a lot of the networks that maybe we see in our city might be ones that don't have permits to be operating as a business, and they're just a guy in a van, and you kind of know because you're part of the community that guy with that color van is someone you can talk to get a ride home from the grocery store with all your packages. And so what I would love to know more from the panel is, with regards to community transit network, is there an issue? Is there a preference? Is there a goal to have some of these networks a little more formal with getting business licenses and safe spaces to operate? And from the city standpoint, of course, we want to know what's happening so we can try to make it better and make sure it's safe for the users and the providers. But from more of the operator standpoint, what are your thoughts? Is it cool to have the whole spectrum, or would you really want this community transit to be living in kind of one of those spots on the spectrum?
That's a really great question. And it's something that I deal with every day with the New York City's dollar van ecosystem. In New York, dollar vans are regulated by the TLC, the Taxi Limousine Commission, and the DOT, but they still have this reputation, especially amongst the regulators, of being a very ragtag group of renegades. But there are operators who are doing everything above board. They have licenses, they have insurance, which is very expensive. And they're trying to provide a safe and transparent service. With my company, one of the things that we tried to do first and foremost was create a data layer that would make the whereabouts of these services and the drivers more transparent to everyone, not only the passengers, but also the regulators. And we found that many of the drivers and operators, they often want to, play above board, but there is this kind of fear of either their business being taken away by government, or them somehow being cracked down on if they don't have all the right paperwork or all the right credentials. So it's a really delicate balance, because I think we see the public need to have transparency and regulation, but at the same time, some folks are vulnerable to these types of things, and they just might need extra support and the confidence that their business will be intact even as they kind of go above lines. So, we just started out by providing a support and service to the drivers and operators that makes their service more visible to folks. But at the end of the day, it's up to the city to regulate them and provide a pathway to compliance. But indeed, it is a challenge. And if it's challenging in New York, where we probably have the most robust informal transit service as well as regulatory system, I can imagine how challenging it can be in other cities too.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. And I guess we'll see maybe the perfect mix of that bottom up and top down in Pittsburgh. If you already have that perspective, I mean, it's so important. I think I would say that we would still want to see cities play a very strong role in managing overall transportation networks. And so especially where a lot of the routes and a lot of the rides and the trips are taken on different systems, if they don't speak to each other, it can be really difficult on the user side. So like in the case of Manila, when I was living in Harlem in New York, I was wishing that I had a tricycle or a jeepney to bring me from the bus stop home. I didn't want to walk late at night by myself or something like that. But at the same time in Manila, you'll have train lines and bus lines and jeepney lines and tricycle lines that don't necessarily speak to one another. And so I'm with 3 different tickets, needing to go probably a ways out of my normal trip pattern just to catch the next ride. And so there's definitely a balance to it, but I think that the city is still playing a really important role on making sure that all the transportation works together, making sure that the public interest is still served through all of it, and that there's fair competition also in business. So you're giving a chance to people who have new ideas and want to bring important community needs to the table that don't have just the resources of an Uber. So I think for all of those reasons, the city has a really strong role to play in making sure that it meets the goals that is set also by the urban development of the place.
I think that's a really great opportunity for me to put a plug in for our Move PGH program, which just officially launched a couple Fridays ago on July 9th. It was along with the welcome of electric scooters to the city of Pittsburgh. We're the first city in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to be allowed to have an electric scooter fleet. We launched this integrated transportation platform because of the exact issue that you're describing, which is if you want to take a bus to a scooter or a bike share bike or a car share car, you have to have 4 different apps or more with different forms of payment and different schedules and information. And we saw that that was a barrier to using these modes of transportation, not only for people for whom they are discretionary modes and who have other options, and also for those who this is the only option they have, but their life is challenged because it's hard to do. And so with our Move PGH program, we brought all this stuff together. 2 years ago, we had a request for proposals that said, hey, industry, we want all of these different providers to work together before they launch in our city so that when you launch, it is an integrated solution. And we have not been successful yet with deep integration of all of those different providers, but we do have one app, the transit app, that you can at least get to these other providers so that you can see what options are available to you. Along with that launch a couple weeks ago, we announced our guaranteed basic mobility pilot because we know that not only is information a barrier to using all these different services, so is the cost itself. And in Pittsburgh, some folks are actually paying more for transportation costs than they are for housing. And so with our guaranteed basic mobility pilot, we're working with one of our communities that has been historically underserved, that is a 15, 20, 25-minute walk to a light rail station, has some transit, but the transit maybe doesn't go right to where it needs to go. And we're working with a small pilot in that community to provide basically free options for all of those modes so that we can see how economic mobility can be improved when transportation and that type of mobility is provided basically free of charge. And so I guess a question for the panel is, now that you've heard what Pittsburgh has done with these very big systems, we've got spin scooters, Zipcar car share, Port Authority of Allegheny County buses. Should we be trying harder to get these community transit providers integrated? Or does that kind of go in the face of what they're there to serve, which is filling the gap? Or have we made the gap that they're filling smaller because now we've broken down a couple of the barriers to the other bigger systems of transportation?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the regional and in the Metro Atlanta region, we're moving towards a more cohesive regional transportation network. That's what I get. I mean, I'm new to the space as well, but that when I think about it in practice, serves a lot of has a lot of challenges for us as a smaller provider. I think when you talk about resources, just being the size that we are, resources don't make it as far down to us as quickly as it should, or as evenly, because we're not using the same data that most of the data is, that most of the funding structures are based on. And to get to that point, we also need a lot of technical assistance for a nonprofit like ours to get there. So when we talk about an entire network that serves the region with all kinds of options, for us, it's a bit, I believe, like if it was to get implemented in the way that we think, a place like CPAC's transportation would be pushed out, and that niche service would eventually cease to exist. I think in the real world, there's always going to be infrastructure gaps. So I think there's always a space and more for CPAC's transportation to exist. But it's definitely going to create more challenges. As I talked to another county transportation agency about how we're going to share appointments and who's going to take what rides, and we have to take we have specific clients that we have to serve, but if we're also serving another request, another rider that is just going to the grocery store, it's a resource. It's a bit of a resource problem for us.
I would just add also that, like you were mentioning data before, data becomes so important to know who you need to serve and how needs are changing. And it's interesting to me that like I was having a conversation with someone and they were talking about some of the counties in England around London were actually mapping their routes and understanding whether they were really optimal or not, because they hadn't done it for a number of years, and finding that some of the routes were completely obsolete now, and they just hadn't like gone back to look at whether or not these bus routes were still working. Whereas we have data coming out of some cities, like in India or Africa, that are down to, okay, majority of the riders are women going to the market and bringing their children to school and taking care of their families. Just because a lot of that hasn't been mapped or hasn't been studied. And so there's a lot of really interesting data about types of trips. In Mexico, one of the cities, one of the districts was naming it neighborhood mobility instead of calling it like homegrown or paratransit or informal, because so many of the trips were just around caretakers moving around their neighborhoods for those types of trips. So I think as you dig more into the data, probably that gap will continue to reveal itself over time, and there's always going to be communities to serve and different solutions on how to do that. So yeah, it would be interesting to see what like the 2.0 of Move PGH will reveal as unlocking the next level.
I do want to commend you though, Kim, for what you folks are doing in Pittsburgh. Julia brings up a great point about leveraging data. And it seems like you guys are already moving in that direction with this initiative to create a more integrated transportation ecosystem with different modes that are accessible from one app. A good example of how data helps inform decisions like this. In New York, we did a research study with the Department of Transportation to identify how many dollar vans are out there, what are the travel patterns of the passengers, how many trips are taken over a given day or month. And we found just like this whole wealth of information that not only did the DOT not know ever, for years, but also the TLC, which is governing these drivers and providing their licenses, they too didn't have this information. But one of the key findings was that, and this was what, 2017 or 2018, at that time, 39% of passengers were taking a dollar van as part of a multimodal trip. So they're transferring into public transit to hop on a subway or transferring from a bus onto a dollar van. And to me, when I learned that gave me a lot of confidence that for my private business or my for-profit company, we should create some type of connector system that is integrated with public transit, since a significant number of people are using dollar vans as like the first or last mile connector. So we should make it easier for people to see, where can they get off a dollar van to hop on a subway or to catch the next bus right when it's about to arrive. So, I think as you follow your nose and look at the data, it'll give you more than enough examples of how to successfully and constructively incorporate informal transit operators into your work. With that being said, I've never been a proponent of like forcing, especially this category of drivers and operators to comply. I think people will move at the pace of trust. So for those operators who see the value of working more closely with local government, they're going to be the first ones to sign up, and they'll be the easier, partners to have. But indeed, it's going to be difficult to get everyone in one swoop. But I think if we are able to show, people the value of working together and that it actually will make a difference in their pockets, it's only a matter of time before we have a more integrated system.
So one observation and then one question for you, Sue, is so that was a compelling argument for me to try to formalize and integrate a little bit, is this idea that if people are using this as part of a longer trip and they're not benefiting from a free transfer between the modes because they're two different non-connected systems, then that's having a huge cost impact on people's transportation, and especially the folks who seem to have the least service from these big publicly funded large scale systems. So if there was a way to kind of integrate to the point that people get the benefit of being viewed as a transfer, and if the transit authority or whoever sees that as also a cost savings because now they're not having to run a bus, they are benefiting by having customers brought to them by these systems that they don't have to maintain or operate, then it seems like there is a little bit of a reason to pursue it further. So the question is, how do I find out more information? How do I, myself and my two staff who I consulted, none of us are from Pittsburgh. We don't have uncles who operated these systems here that we can get kind of that inside knowledge on. So, we're trying to do more about hiring folks that do have those relationships and things. But short of that, do you have recommendations for how someone in a department like mine might be able to make inroads with these operators?
I do. I think you have this like spectrum or continuum of how you can, poor choice of words, but like infiltrate, these systems. For one, on one end of the spectrum, this is something that I did when I first got started and realized that, all right, I really want to work in this space, but I don't know anyone besides my uncles and the people that they're introducing me to. I simply went to the neighborhoods where the routes were, and I just sat there for hours or for days, creating relationships, talking to the drivers, talking to the passengers who were getting on and off, and learning about how the service works and who the actors in this ecosystem were. The great thing about these types of informal networks is that the drivers are there every day, right? This is their livelihood. So there is this like community neighborhood fabric that's involved that allows you to build relationships that can retain over time. So I knew that if I just kind of was around enough, I'll eventually meet the right people and be able to win their trust, and they'll be able to bring me closer to where the real action is and share more and more information. Not the most scalable approach, but it is one way to kind of get your foot in the door. And people appreciate being able to see people and really work with them like in that type of close setting. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you could hire researchers or a company like Dollaride to do some of this type of work for you. Shameless plug there. But this is precisely why I wanted to start this business. Is so that we could be this like connector between the public transit infrastructure and informal transit networks. But ultimately the tactics that my team and I would use would be some combination of research that we can do online and digitally, but probably more importantly, literally getting out in the field, having boots on the ground and creating the type of relationships that will give you the insights that a book or a computer can't actually give you.
Yeah, that's exactly how I had to do it too. When I first started was I had to start taking those calls. I had to actually go and pick up seniors myself, and that's how I got a beat on everything. Like now I kind of feel a lot of the drivers are like, Frank, you have no idea. You have no idea how the service runs. And I kind of took offense, but then I was like, oh yeah, I had no idea how this ran. And so we're getting to the research part that you talk about. But yeah, that's how I had to had to learn the hard way, had to learn the long way.
I like that both of you are talking, have brought up about community. And when you think about innovation in transportation, we always think it's this like unicorn tech solution. How are both of you in your experiences thinking about where innovation and community come together, and how that will play a role in giving us a kind of a transportation solution that we haven't seen before?
Ooh, I love this question. For one, although our business is a tech company, you would be surprised at how low tech some of our tactics and our work is, and it's by design. Much like what I said earlier, we really needed to get as close to the people as possible, and sometimes that just means getting out of the office and taking a ride or several rides with drivers to really learn what is their day-to-day like. So that's a practice that we do almost daily at our company. There's someone that's a part of our team who's taking rides with drivers and learning firsthand, what are the challenges in their experience that could eventually be solved with some sort of technology. I'm sorry, could you repeat your question?
I'm thinking about the kind of the entrepreneurial approach that you're taking to mobility, like linking entrepreneurship, technology, and the communities that you're serving, to come up with something that we haven't, maybe it's the scale also of the dollar van. So it's not like it's not an Uber ride, it's like point to point with one person. You're getting, you're collecting multiple people from different destinations and drop-offs. I mean, I think that, sorry, you can hear my child crying. It's bedtime here in Spain. So I was just wondering about like how you think of dollar van or the Frank's service, where you think the next wave of mobility, what we're going to be learning from when we look at your examples.
I'll be really quick with this, and then I definitely love to hear what Frank has to say, especially with what you're seeing in Atlanta. One of the things that I think is a good example of like this culmination between technology, community, and mobility. We realized quite a while ago that the drivers in particular have a ton of local knowledge and intuition about the mobility patterns of the people in their neighborhoods, and even like sometimes sometimes it's like almost like ethnographic insight, where they kind of know that this population of folks from the Caribbean are in droves moving to Eastern Brooklyn because of some certain event.
So interesting. Yeah.
Or like some type of change in housing or real estate. So like there's these population level movement, and because of that, for them, they intuitively know that there's going to be more business in these areas because this population of people is familiar with their style of service, or this area where people are moving doesn't have a great subway system and bus network. So, when we realized that these drivers had some incredible insight, we were scrambling to figure out how do we empower the drivers to actually create the service for us. So as a technology company, instead of us being top down and saying, this is where a new route should be, this is how many drivers we need on this particular route, we started to create tools that allow the drivers to make that decision on behalf of the entire network. So now a driver can scout a route and then basically like press a button in the app that records them scouting a new route. And then the coordinates of that new route get sent to our tech team, which they will implement into the service so that everyone can access that route. So, I think the crux of the story here is that oftentimes the innovation is coming from the community, but they might need some sort of catalyst or tool to transcribe it into a technological innovation. But the insights are right underneath our noses.
So the things that are kind of percolating in my mind right now, I'm constantly a bureaucrat, is, why did these networks develop to begin with? I think probably with Frank's population, there was maybe a language, implication. I think in Sue, I know my personal experience is cabs don't stop for everybody. And some of those barriers, even when you call them, I know of people who've had rides declined when they said, no, I'm the person who called you to pick me up. And they said, no. And so I know that a lot of times these networks are probably born out of those barriers. And I'm wondering, as technology helps to break down some of those barriers and add accountability where they weren't before, it seems like still I would maybe be inclined to use a Dollaride because it's a dollar ride if it's $1 versus the cost that might be much higher if I were taking a brand name TNC. Long-winded way of saying, what do you think the future is of these systems, given that some of those barriers are being broken down to using other slightly more formal systems? And also the reverse, do you think like TNCs, which are pretty pricey to use and probably pricey to operate, and I don't know if any of them are making money at this point, I just don't know. If they go away, do you see that the community transit is staying instead because they figured out a way to do it kind of more affordably?
Excellent question. Well, I do think that the direction that we are going is, and that we should go, is a much more closer relationship with public transit agencies and our local government. I believe, Julia, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there have been some like more recent initiatives or collaborations in Manila to where the public transit system there is contracting informal transit operators and having them, professionally or commercially work on specific routes. I think the more we can get to that type of model where the public transit, respects the value that informal transit is providing and sees the economic benefit and cost savings that they can have in contracting these drivers and their fleet owners, that's where we can get longevity and sustainability. Although the cost is $1, on some routes, it doesn't necessarily mean that the driver is making a living wage. So, this is something that I found out after like really crunching the numbers and understanding how much drivers have to pay if they are going to stay compliant. This cost of insurance and gas and maintenance and all these things. So, I think there's definitely a need to ensure that people are making a livable wage and structuring the service so that it's accessible to the passengers, but also sustainable for the drivers to operate. I hope that answers your question.
I think part of it, yeah, I'm wondering where the sweet spot is of these systems being more fully integrated so that the transit system even can rely on them and say, you know what, maybe we don't need to invest in a smaller bus that is on demand, but instead we need to invest in this other network. But there is that sort of tipping point of, well, but if we do that, then all of a sudden they need to comply with federal funding requirements or something else if they're going to be receiving money that was government money and things like that. So I know it's a very delicate balance, and I'm just wondering where the sweet spot is to maximize utility and safety and accessibility of these systems, but not over bureaucratizing them to the point where they fail, since they are serving a community and probably arguably the most challenging community to, I don't want to say infiltrate, because that's not what we're here to do, but we're trying to serve communities, and it's hard to talk to every single person that lives in your city. And so I think that there's probably a lot of overlap between the communities that are using this community transit and the communities that also maybe aren't coming to public meetings because some of the same barriers to transportation and others are preventing them from engaging in our kind of outdated processes. So I know we're almost out of time here, but I
I think
certainly
that's a
have learned
really,
a lot.
yeah, that's a really good point though. I think at the end of the day, there's no right answer to that question, but just to recognize the fact that departments of transportation cannot do everything. You know, the government is not doing everything and can't have every answer to every problem. So that relationship, the closer relationship to different parties reaching out and engaging those stakeholders is already like the first best step.
Very well said.
All right. Well, thank you, Sue, Julia, Kim, and Frank for a dynamic conversation. And thank you all for listening.